we must look at the views of women in a different way, because I think it's very clear the ecological prudence of women are much greater. Ecological prudence or living with the environment. Take in my own country, many of you know the famous example of what is called chipko, that is the hugging the trees. It was the woman who started when in the Himalayas, trees were being cut indiscriminately by traders and merchants. These women said, you first cut us and then you cut the tree. It's called the chipko movement. Now that was not started by a man, because man was cutting the trees. Similarly, even the choice of trees, for example, if it is a woman who was planting in the Himalayas trees, they will prefer a broad-leafed plant like oak or something of that kind, which will give them fodder also. In the case of men, they will go for pine, because the pine resin, the pine oil, the pine wood, all of them are complete. Same is true in Africa, I think, with reference to food crops and commercial crops. There is a gender dimension everywhere, but in Africa in particular, much stronger in terms of food and crops which are used for market or commerce. So we must listen to the woman in all the debates. Having one more point I want to add. There are also a lot of things I said women have living with nature very closely, because as Barbara and the princess said, gathering food, water, fuel, fodder, every one of them, they live much closely to the earth. And they have a lot of ideas on how to cope with calamities. From their own life, it's a struggle. The struggle, whether it's urban slum or rural poor woman, it's a struggle in their life. So they have learned by struggle a large amount of wisdom in terms of managing. I have seen in Orissa, what we call tribal areas or indigenous people, as some people call them, method by which they manage their own. They conserve all the genetic material. They are great conservers. I have seen a woman who has not gone to school, but she has maintained about 30 varieties of rice. And if you ask her, no, if there's a drought here, this is better. If floods come, this is better. They know. And their terminology also, the tribal terminology, taxonomy, is not Linnaean taxonomy, but in terms of what use that plant is and so on. So in managing the climate change at the local level, particularly in developing countries, both men and women, point I want to make, differentiate between rural areas and urban areas and look at the needs much more closely. Both cases there are special needs, gender-specific needs, but they must be attended to. And finally, look at the way in which they have been managing many of them. Lastly, the capacity building of women, particularly living in poverty, is exceedingly important. We have seen, in our own programs, we have seen very coming from socially underprivileged sections, economically underprivileged. They are able to master technology, provided the methodology of learning, the pedagogic methodology, is learning by doing, not by lecturing, by doing. For example, information technology. They run the computer center, they run the knowledge center. One thing we have found, bridging the digital divide is a very powerful method of bridging the gender divide. One of those poor, so what you call poor woman, has come in Geneva and addressed the World Summit on Information Society. People are shocked the way in which she explained in her own language, not in English and so on. So there is, by engendering the whole program, we have multiple benefits. Everybody, both men and women, will both benefit.
Absolutely. Barbara, do you think some of these amazing solutions that the women have found for themselves to cope with the effects of climate change and also to cope with their situation they live in can actually be somehow systemized? Can it be upgraded so that it can be spread across and benefited from, and therefore adopted then as policy later on in Copenhagen even?
Yes, I do, but I think we've got to be a bit careful at the moment, because women are just trying to survive, really. The adaptation that they're doing, it's not that they're planning adaptation because they know climate change is happening. They're just doing what they need to do to survive from day to day, month to month. Now, out of that...
So they don't know what they're in for? They don't know what's happening?
Many of them do not know what is happening to them at all, and that's why, as I was emphasising yesterday in the discussion, helping people understand what climate change is all about about so they have the power at least to take better decisions for themselves about what they want is important. But I do think, coming back to your point, it is possible to start beginning to see the lessons about where people are doing different things. You know, I mean, and they're very practical, they're very small scale. You know, the issues about fuel efficient stoves and so on, so that there's less need for walking to firewood, and there's also helping the environment again in that way. All those things, yes, can be aggregated up to say there are some things we do know, and as long as we start using the information society to learn more and faster about what different people are doing, we can bring that up. Now that, yes, needs to be brought into Copenhagen, but I do think most of all it needs to be built into the national adaptation plans, because as MS has said, we all know him as MS, you know, that the urban and the rural situations are quite different, and you will need different solutions in those different places. So it's very important that, again, it's back to the voice. Women need to have the say nationally about how adaptation is going to take place, bring in their ideas, bring in their new solutions as well. But, you know, also get the finance to make it possible for them, and not just to have to cope again without any additional resource to help them.
I think the finance, that's a very important issue. Can I remind you, if anyone has a question for the panelists or would like to participate, please, go ahead, please.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. I'm Roger Martin, Chairman of the Optimum Population Trust. And in my session yesterday, Melini Mera pointed out that the human face is really important, and I totally agreed. And like her, I was thrilled when Barbara and Margaret Chan said yesterday that priority to female education and empowerment is the most important thing for development and for meeting the challenge of climate change. So, and after many years as a diplomat in Asia and Africa, I have felt that very strongly. My last official speech in Zimbabwe 20 years ago as Deputy High Commissioner was on the theme of why I am a feminist. So that answers your earlier question, and I still am. However, I'd like to suggest a more radical approach which will hit many targets at once. The primary aims of all of us in this room, but also could appeal to the economists and the engineers meeting and others meeting in Copenhagen, and the politicians, which is to, having broken this frankly crazy taboo about population policy, policies to stabilize populations, which have all sorts of benefits. If that taboo can be broken and it can be promoted as an advocacy for every country in the world, and notably the rich countries. My organization's primary target is to get a population stabilization policy in place in the UK by 2015. And we're working on this, and we may or may not get there. But if a body like this were to point out that having population stabilization policies in place in rich and poor countries would reduce the number of future climate change causes in the rich countries and reduce the number of climate change victims in the poor countries, and empower half the population of the poorest countries to play an active role in adaptation, mitigation, and above all, in liberating and giving them, as individuals, control over their own fertility. Like Melini Mera, I could quote many, many human stories where I've encountered this among rural people in Africa and Asia. And it is truly pathetic, the story you told me about the mother-in-law. It is absolutely typical, but other countries have shown, India is very special because it's so large, but other countries have shown that with the right priority, Thailand is a classic conservative society. Iran, also very conservative society. The right policies, government policy with aid resources behind it, would help. And since the primary aim of Copenhagen is to reduce future carbon emissions, they ought to have their minds expanded from the accountancy of emissions trading and so on, to look at a more radical way of doing this with major other benefits. That is to say, by reducing the number of future carbon emitters, of course non-coercively, no one wants coercive policies, in both the rich and the poor countries. So that is my proposition to this conference. It could be a big new initiative coming out of it, quite apart from all the wider environmental benefits which are in the sheet of paper I've got to distribute. Thank you.
How do you put in place those population stabilization policies, and how do you make developing countries adhere to them?